individual Belkutasi, recalling in this way all his former perceptions, experiencings, and manifestations, clearly constated in consequence that his exterior manifestations did not at all correspond either to the perceptions or to the impulses definitely formed in him. Further, he then began to make similar sincere observations of the impressions coming from outside, as well as those formed within himself, which were perceived by his common presence. And he made them all with the same exhaustive, conscious verifications of how these impressions were perceived by his separate spiritualized parts, how and on what occasions they were experienced by the whole of his presence, and for what manifestations they became impulses. These exhaustive conscious observations and impartial constatations finally convinced Belkutasi that something proceeded in his own common presence, not as it should have proceeded according to sane being logic. As it became clear to me during my subsequent detailed investigations, although Belkutasi had become indubitably convinced of the accuracy of his observations on himself, yet he doubted the correctness of his own sensations and understandings, and also the normalness of his own psychic organization. And he therefore set himself the task of elucidating first of all whether he was in general normal in sensing and understanding all this just in this way and not otherwise. To carry out this task of his, he decided to find out how the same would be sensed and cognized by others. With that aim, he began inquiring among his friends and acquaintances to try to find out from them how they sensed it all, and how they cognized their past and present perceptions and manifestations. Doing this, of course, very discreetly, so as not to touch the aforementioned impulses inherent in them, namely self-love, pride, and so on, which are unbecoming to three-brained beings. Thanks to these inquiries, Belkutasi gradually succeeded in evoking sincerity in his friends and acquaintances, and as a result, it turned out that all of them sensed and saw in themselves everything just the same as he did. Now, among these friends and acquaintances of Belkutasi, there were several earnest beings who were not yet entirely slaves to the action of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and who, having penetrated to the gist of the matter, also became very seriously interested in it, and began to verify that which proceeded in themselves, and independently to observe those around them. Soon after, on the initiative of the same Belkutasi, they began to meet together from time to time and to share their observations and new constatations. After prolonged verifications, observations, and impartial constatations, this entire group of terrestrial beings also became categorically convinced, just like Belkutasi himself, that they were not as they ought to be. Not long after, many others also having such presences joined that group of terrestrial beings. And later, they founded that society which they named the Society of Achaldans. By the word Achaldan, the following conception was then expressed: the striving to become aware of the sense and aim of the being of beings. From the very beginning of the foundation of this society, Belkutasi himself stood at its head, and the subsequent actions of the beings of this society proceeded under his general guidance. For many terrestrial years, this society existed under the said name, and its member beings were then called Achaldan Sovurs. But later, when the members of this society, for purposes of a general character, were divided into a number of independent groups, the members belonging to different groups came to be called by different names. And this division of theirs into groups occurred for the following reason. When they had finally become convinced that there was something very undesirable in their presences, and they had begun to seek means and possibilities of achieving its removal in order to become such as, according to sane logic, they ought to have been, corresponding to the sense and aim of their existence, the elucidation of which, whatever it might have cost them, they made the basis of their task. And when they proceeded to actualize in practice this task previously decided upon by their reason, it very soon became clear that it was imperatively necessary for its fulfillment to have in their reason more detailed information of various special branches of knowledge. But as it proved impossible for each and every one of them to acquire the necessary special knowledge, they divided themselves for convenience into a number of groups so that each group might separately study one of these special branches of knowledge required for their common aim. Here, my boy, you should notice that genuine objective science just then arose and began to exist there for the first time, and developed normally up to the time of the second great catastrophe to their planet. Also, that the rate of the development of some of its separate branches then progressed at an indeed unprecedented tempo. And in consequence, many great and small cosmic what are called objective truths gradually began at that period to become evident also to those three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. The learned members of this first and perhaps last great terrestrial learned society were then divided into 7 independent groups, or as it is otherwise said, sections. And each of these groups or sections received its definite designation. The members of the first group of the society, Achaldan, were called Achaldan Folksovors, which meant that the beings belonging to that section studied the presence of their own planet, as well as the reciprocal action of its separate parts. The members of the second section were called Achaldan Strassovors, and this meant that the beings belonging to that section studied what are called the radiations of all the other planets of their solar system, and the reciprocal action of these radiations. The members of the third section were called Achaldan Metrosovors, which meant beings occupied with the study of that branch of knowledge similar to that branch of our general knowledge we call Silkornano, and which partly corresponded to what your contemporary favorites called mathematics. The members of the fourth group were called Achaldan Psychosovors, and by this name they then defined those members of the society Achaldan who made their observations of the perceptions, experiencings, and manifestations of beings like themselves and verified their observations by statistics. The members of the fifth group were called Achaldan Harnosovors, which meant that they were occupied with the study of that branch of knowledge which combined those 2 branches of contemporary science there, which your favorites call chemistry and physics. The members belonging to the sixth section were called Achaldan Mistesovors, that is to say, beings who studied every kind of fact arising outside of themselves, those